A very warm welcome. We are Globalisation, Consolidation live. Hope we're all doing well. On today's session, we are going to be consolidating the first few lessons of the globalisation topic in A-level geography. So, inquiry question 1, what are the causes of globalisation and why has it accelerated in recent decades? So in your notes, we want to have quite extensive examples of what are the causes of globalisation and an understanding in considerable depth about the reasons it has accelerated in recent decades. We'll talk about a few other things that you need and should know, including a definition for the term globalisation and, of course, an understanding of the flows that are taking place to allow globalisation to develop in the way that it currently is. So let's little think then about the first few sessions that we looked at. This is the point of the spec that we're at. Spec 3.1, globalisation involves the widening, deepening global connections, interdependence and flows. Remember I mentioned in our lessons, flows are crucial. You need to understand what those flows are: commodities, capital, information, migrants, tourists. Make sure you have those in your notes. All globalisation essays should start with a definition of globalisation and a bit of context. It's a term that came about in the 1990s, mainly referring to global economic changes that started to occur post-1945. But as you learned in your lessons, globalisation has always occurred. And next week, you're going to be looking at the roots of globalisation, which goes all the way back to Christopher Columbus. Now, the EDEXCEL definition, it's worth just learning this now. Get it in your notes. Make sure that the start of your globalisation notes has a very clear definition that you can recall at any point. Globalisation is the process by which people, their cultures, money, goods, and information can be transferred between countries with few or no barriers. Now, that's an interesting point at the end there, and we'll come to that later on in the course. Further definitions, there's lots that exist out there, and some people like at the start of an essay to say that there are contrasting definitions out there, purely because globalisation is complex. It's very difficult to define. Some people like to say there's a plethora of definitions out there, but I do quite like that EDEXCEL one that's used in the textbook. But there are a number that you could potentially use here. There's one from the IMF and one from the World Bank. The World Bank one is really interesting, actually, but probably not worth learning off by heart. But it makes the point clear. It might mean sitting in your living room in Estonia while communicating with a friend in Zimbabwe. It might mean taking a Bollywood dance class in London, or it might be symbolised eating an equatorial bananas in the European Union. This account emphasises there are non-economic dimensions to globalisation too, including social, cultural and political interactions. As I said in our lessons this week, we need to understand the different types of globalisation, including social, cultural, political. Although sometimes you'll find in a lot of the textbooks, social, cultural are merged into one, but I'll define them separately for you shortly. Important point to make. Maybe when you're answering an essay on this question, that globalisation is not an end result, but a continuing process. Really important that you understand that we've not achieved globalisation. It's not an end result. It's always going to be a continuing process. So make sure that you understand the key terms and the ideas behind the definition. Now, I certainly would go back and look at some of the ideas that I'm putting and posting up here on these slides. Feel free to pause them if you want to extract and develop anything else for your notes. The only thing I would say here at the end is that this Trade Union Congress definition of globalisation emphasises at the end, look at the current form of globalisation with the international rules and policies that underpin it has brought poverty and hardship to millions of workers, particularly those in developing and transition countries. That's something people don't make reference to at the start, that there are winners and losers. And that definition I like because it clearly says from the start, hey, it's not all good. So very useful. Summary, based on all the definitions here, it's hard to really pinpoint a clear definition. And you could emphasize it is a complex term, a range of factors are involved. Hopefully that will help you. Now, I said it is important that you have a very clear understanding of the factors involved in globalization and make sure that you understand that we have between 4 and 5 main types, depending on if you merge social and cultural into one. Some people, as you can probably see, social is including what some textbooks say is demographic. So if you've learned it as demographic, that's kind of the same as social. But essentially, we have economic migration, which involves the movement of migrant families to different areas. We have the growth of online social networks that create social connections between people in far-off lands and makes people want to go to different places and live and work in different places. Cultural, and you'll notice, and as I said, these are all interlinked, and I mentioned that in the lesson. It's hard to really say, if I'm looking at cultural here in the bottom right, the growth of a global culture, the localization of products. Well, that's all driven by the top left, the transnational corporations who drive economic globalization. Global money markets, and again, you could argue that this is where some of the international governmental organizations, the IGOs, play a big part in the economic side of things. But you could also argue that they play a part down here in global governance. The G8 and other global bodies play a big part in maintaining political globalization. They also put policies in place that may change the environment, that may change trade. But actually, I like, and I've put down here as a little addition, environmental globalization as a separate one. But what you'll probably notice here, out of all these types of globalization, again, it's complex and it's not clear. As long as you're able to, in your notes, demonstrate an understanding of the different types of globalization. And remember, different textbooks will give you slightly different headings to say what those main types are. But I think as long as you've got those ones that I have in front of you there, 1 through to 5, we will have it nailed. If you want to try and understand in more depth, feel free to pause these slides and try and match them up. What type of globalization refers to the transmission of ideas, meanings, and values around the world in such a way as to extend and intensify social relations? This normally consists of Western cultural traits dominating territories. That is indeed cultural. That can be driven by Western cultural traits, can include music, can include the idea of food, which is sometimes driven by TNCs, the likes of McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and so on. The next one refers to the growth of trading blocs, free trade agreements, and global organizations. The emergence of national, international, and non-governmental organizations act as watchdogs over governments and have increased their activities and influence. Can you guess what that type is? It is indeed political. Remember I said it involves those big organizations that make decisions that affect us all. So that's 2 of them. I've already brought up economic at the end there because it kind of says it in it, doesn't it? It refers to the increasing integration and interdependence of national, regional, and local economies across the world. We talk about the role that TNCs play in driving economic globalization. But also transport plays a big part here because goods can be moved by improvements in technology. If you think of containerization in that process, which we'll talk a lot about later in the course. The one at the end, social, refers to how population structure have changed as a result of shifting population characteristics such as migration, immigration, and emigration. You will see that in some of the textbooks as demographic globalization. But as I said, it doesn't matter. As long as you define what you're coining the meaning of, then it will be fine. Environmental refers to the holistic approach to natural problems and issues, looking at international environment rather than just local or national issues. So again, you could link that up with TNCs though, couldn't you? They are themselves creating environmental damage through having TNCs operating in low-income countries with factories, headquarters and HSEs, etc. So I mentioned the term flow in the lesson, and it's really important that you understand what those main flows are. And if you're still not sure what do we mean by a flow is the connection between places, how various networks travel from one place to another. What are those flows? Goods in terms of commodities, services, capital in terms of money. And if you just think back to those previous slides, we know that the drivers of some of those flows are TNCs, international governmental organizations, people through, again, sometimes social or cultural globalization, whether it be migration or as tourists. Information, we can now go on the internet and access whatever we want. It can flow from one part of the world very quickly. You know, if it's someone posting about a hack or a way to get access to something easier, all of a sudden everyone in the world can know very quickly, which links in with technology. The internet allows things to flow. Labor certainly flows. If we look at you know, some of the high-end labor, if we talk about the movement of Premiership footballers or the movement of movie stars, or even if we're thinking the Middle East at the moment, Qatar, with the movement of migrant labor from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, building the football stadiums and various other buildings that have been built. Culture, we know culture flows, and that can flow largely from high-income countries, often Western countries, spreading culture. Although you could argue now the rise of Bollywood, the rise of K-pop, there are a number of cultures that move around the world and blend in with other cultures. And we'll talk a lot about that later on, but it's a really interesting part of globalization. I've give you a few examples, but you can pause here if you want and think of what are more flows that are going on, or examples of flows linked under these different headings. But in your notes, most certainly make sure that you've defined what flow means, which I've got up here for you, and then some examples of types of flows that we have. Hopefully that is helpful. I've defined a few of them here for you, so I won't go into too much detail. But again, just feel free to pause this, and you can, of course, if you missed what I was saying there about the role that these different flows play, you can copy down for your notes a definition under here. So what have we done so far? We've defined globalization, which should be in your notes. We've now talked about the 5 or 4 main types of globalization and explained them. You should have that in your notes. We've now looked at the global flows and given examples of those that are kind of helping these different types of globalization exist. That should also be in your notes. So quick recap, the story so far. What do you need to have in your notes? Definition of globalization, the types of globalization I've mentioned so far. Can you name 2 flows that we see globally? And name the type of globalization that flow might fall into? What do I mean by the terms commodity and capital? Pause now on this video and make sure that you have all of that in your notes. This is all about making sure that note consolidation is taking place. Remember, feel free to send myself or Mr. Driscoll an email if you're unsure on any of this, but I'm hoping this video will clarify that for you. Some key terms that we're going to be using, and you'll have heard me in the last week use globalization, the changing of the design or product to meet local tastes or laws, often carried out by TNCs. Good example being McDonald's. When you go to countries like Germany, you might have the McFrankfurter. You might also be able to get with your meal a McBeer. Again, it's all tailored to the needs of the local culture. If you go to to India, for example, and go to a McDonald's, you can get the McPaneer, which is, effectively their version of a Big Mac, but instead of a meat patty from beef, it is a kind of cheese patty that is replacing it due to local culture / religion. So it's the way TNCs kind of customize or make more local their global product. And that's to make sure that sales stay high and they adapt to the setting of the local place. Hybridization. I've not used that in my lesson yet, but I will be very soon. But that's the process by which a cultural element such as food, language, or music blend into another culture by modifying the element to fit cultural norms. You could argue this happened quite considerably with food in the UK. So when Indian food started to become popular in the UK, let's go back to the kind of 50s, 60s onwards, and the rise of the chicken tikka masala, a dish that is not actually Indian, but it's a kind of hybrid version of a curry that's been made very, very British. It's came into the host culture and adapted to suit. There's plenty examples linked to music and certain languages where countries refer to words that might not exist in their language or revert to an English version of the word. But we'll talk more about this term later on in the course. I've made multiple references to TNCs at the moment, and those are simply transnational corporations, basically businesses who have operations spread across the world, operating in many nations, often the headquarters in a high-income or developed country, and their factories and other regional buildings that are maybe involved in production or sometimes customer services might be found in other parts of the world. Here's my example of the chicken tikka masala. I really like this quote from former Foreign Secretary Robin Cook. Chicken tikka masala is now a true British national dish, not only because it is the most popular, but because it is a perfect illustration of the way Britain absorbs and adapts external influences. What a fantastic quote by former Foreign Secretary Robin Cook. I really like that picture up there as well. It's making me feel hungry. So chicken tikka masala, as I mentioned earlier, a good example of cultural hybridization by which the majority culture can create a more acceptable symbol or version, and it creates a kind of new culture. It's not traditional to either of them, but it becomes kind of blended. I hope that makes sense. I mentioned your McDonald's example there. I would learn globalization and learn a few McDonald's examples. Maybe you want to put that down in your notes. We're going to be doing a number of TNC case studies as we go through the course. It's worth starting to build up your knowledge of something like Apple at the moment. Do all countries experience the same level of global connectivity? Now, remember the spec talks about the depth of connections and the lengthening of global connections. Now, I think just in case you're confused by that spec point and you're thinking, right, I've got all my notes, but I don't understand about this idea of the deepening or lengthening of global connections. Well, hopefully this will sum up for you. Low-income countries, I've put down there Sudan as an example, and we can think of back to 2017 when South Sudan experienced a famine between February and July. And, many people were saying it was kind of cut off from the rest of the world. There was not much of an international reaction. They're very isolated from the kind of global influences. And that's why you'd probably put the low-income nations down this kind of shallow, as in they have shallow depth of connections and their length of global connections exist quite near to them. So basically, low-income countries don't experience the same level, whether it be the lengthening or deepening of global connections. They're very inexperienced in that sense. Middle-income countries, if we think of Brazil, poor people still rely on local produce, but often can work for foreign firms. So they're beginning to have lengthening global connections or deeper global connections. They might start to have influences from global culture, or at least an awareness of it. So let's think of the Brazil football team. They may well like to check up on what the latest Chelsea football score is because they know one of their Brazilian players plays there. Or the women's soccer league in America, there's a lot of Brazilian players playing that. Also, a lot of Brazilian players play in the Chinese soccer league. So maybe, they're checking up on that. Music as well, is there that kind of increase in global music that may well have Portuguese music in it or Portuguese rap. What about political awareness as well? Is Brazil, with Bolsonaro as their leader, becoming more aware of the role that their country is playing in destroying the Amazon and so on? High-income countries, on the other hand, they are far global connections and very deep global connections. So high-income countries, it almost follows the more developed you are, the more deeper and kind of far your global connections go. I think that's the summary statement you want to have in your notes in this first bullet point. So high-income countries, the UK, majority of people are affluent and are consuming global products and culture all the time. You may well be watching imported TV films or series on Netflix, enjoying watching Money Heist, which was originally Spanish but now translated into English. Or most people travel far. You may maybe go on 1 or 2 foreign holidays or have parents or relatives who travel for work, and then you'll be back 3-4 days later. This is the more developed you get, the length of your global connections increase, but also the depth. You're really exploring culture and areas of your life that are really deep into consuming and enjoying global connections as part of your everyday life. It's a great summary slide, and I hope that's helped you understand what we mean by the depth of connections and how it changes depending on what country you live in, your experience of the world. I've been trying to get us to understand that we could be given a source in an exam or an exam question that uses a range of arrows and what we would call kind of proportional flow diagrams. So it's important that you're able to understand and interpret data that's shown here. So this is showing major international trade. It's all the way back in 1999, so it's quite a long time ago. Things have changed a lot. But what we could say from this, it's in million tons. But if we look at the thicker the arrow, the greater the international trade in crude oil. So we can go straight in to look where the thick arrows are, and we understand quite quickly that the international flows are really huge from Saudi Arabia. That's that green country that you can see with the quite considerable number of arrows coming from it that are very thick. So immediately, proportional flow diagrams allow us to understand where the greatest concentration of whatever it is you've been shown. So make sure that you understand that. Any questions, get in touch. In your lesson and on your Google Classroom, I've uploaded a few more examples. One of them is remittances, which is the money sent home by a migrant from the host country they're in back to country of origin. We'll come back to that later on in the course as well. I've got a nice little video here for you. I'm not going to show you it right now, but you can, of course, to summarize some of the content we've already been discussing, go to Globalization Explained. It's on YouTube. There is the header if you want to go to that later and just consolidate what I've been saying further. Moving on to the factors that have accelerated globalization in recent decades. Now, this was your kind of second main lesson, and I want you to make sure your notes have what the main accelerating factors are and be able to evaluate the role of the two greatest factors, including technology and ICT, and of course, transport. But when you're thinking about the role transport has played in accelerating globalization, I want you to make sure you understand the concept of a shrinking world, and the idea that technology and transport together have led to this unprecedented space-time compression, or time-space compression, however you want to say it. But really important then that you take away the two most important accelerating factors in globalization are the role of technology and ICT, brackets, communication, and transport. Those are the two main factors: technology, ICT, brackets, communications, and transport. Those are the two biggest factors accelerating globalization. And I like to say the third, which just sits under them, is TNCs. The reason why I wouldn't put TNCs as a greater accelerating factor than those two is because TNCs rely on technology and ICT and transport in order to have the influence they have in accelerating globalization. I would make sure in your notes you've extracted some of the reasons why we have a shrinking world. And it's the developments in technology, particularly linked to transport, where the best average speed in the 15 to 1800s was 10 miles an hour. You can fast forward to the 1960s, and we've got 500 to 700 mile an hour speeds on a jet passenger aircraft. And then from the 90s, slowly developing up to today, the world is even smaller. Not physically smaller, but it feels much smaller. And that's because of technology allows us to instantly touch a button, and cyberspace information can transfer from one place in the world to another in seconds. Make sure you understand this term shrinking world and what we mean by a space-time compression, which means, some places more than others depend on these connections. And as we've improved transport, it's quicker to get to different parts of the world, which means space doesn't feel as significant as it would have in the past. The idea in the past, you could be going 3 weeks to get across the Atlantic, whereas now you're talking 5 or 6 hours. Note, the idea of shrinking world is not the same as a more integrated world. So what I mean by that is there may well be the idea of a shrinking world, that developments in transport and technology have helped space and time feel less important. But actually, there's some places that are still not part of that, not necessarily integrated into this change that many of us have experienced. For example, the latest 2019 figure that I have is that 52% of the world have access to the internet. We're not all part of this cyberspace, tiny world where we can instantly speak to others. I remember when I started teaching this specification back in 2016, I would say to students, only 48%, less than half of the world has access to the internet. Less than half. So we think it's the norm that you just go on the internet, whereas people in many of our low-income and even middle-income countries, and even in high-income countries, are still not part of this space-time compression where you can simply click a button and be in touch with people across the world. Really important. So I have added, and many people say, but if you only have transport, ICT, brackets, communications, and then throw TNCs in there, you're missing the huge role that comes through political globalization. And at the end of the day, TNCs wouldn't be able to do the deals they do if it wasn't for the rules of trade that's set by the international organizations like WTO, World Trade Organization, IMF, International Monetary Fund, WB, World Bank. So you may well want, and I'm not saying you could have a 12-mark question which looks at assessing the main factors accelerating globalization. There's your 4 main factors. You could argue transport is key, ICT is key, but TNCs are the ones driving all of this by using transport and ICT. And then, of course, a little caveat you could put in as a final paragraph: international organizations allow TNCs to be able to carry out these operations by putting certain trade rules in place. So that could be a nice question, and that would be the easiest way. Use those 4 main factors, get those into your notes. I have in your lesson with that table, there are others, there are many others that are on that list, but I would learn lots of examples and reasons why these are the most important factors. Now, I've put lots of text after those 4 main factors there, which again, please do pause, use it to structure your notes, write it down, do whatever you need to do, type it up, but hopefully your notes will now have the main factors that have accelerated globalization with some examples. The next session, which won't be in this consolidation lesson because we've not actually moved on to this, but as I said to you, this inquiry question 1 looks at a number of these factors across your next 4 or 5 lessons. So don't think to yourself, oh, I've not got that much notes. What I would do now is make sure you have an understanding of the accelerating factors and some decent little mini examples to back it up. And then you'll do standalone lessons on why transport's important, why ICT is important, the role of political organizations, the role of TNCs. That will come. So don't worry, but make sure that you have decent notes on these factors. I know a number of you have come across some key terms in the textbook and asked, I'm not sure about time-space convergence. Don't have good definition in my notes. So I would say it is the process concerns the changing relationship between time and space. What I mean by that is the impact of transport, or the improvements that transport has allowed, has changed the relationship between time and space. The idea that the concept of speed indicates how much space can be traveled over a specific amount of time. And that has definitely converged. What's made it converge? Well, it's the technological innovations in transportation and communication, which means distant places are brought closer. Closer, how? What do you mean? And I'm not talking physically closer. It's came closer in terms of the time taken to travel or send messages between them. Now, if we want to get really detailed and very complex about this, I would definitely get some interesting and detailed key terms down here that I'm going to describe now, which is time-space convergence leads to the reduction in the friction of distance, or the frictional effect of distance. Now, what do I mean by friction of distance? And I've put the key term on the right-hand side. Feel free to pause and take down. As the distance from a place increases, the interactions with that place decrease, usually because of the time and cost involved. That idea can be seen very closely by looking at where Brits tend to holiday. So, for instance, the greatest number of tourists from the UK tend to go to France, Spain, or maybe across the Atlantic in America, but a huge concentration every year when it's not COVID times tend to go in vast numbers, millions, to Spain and France. Whereas if we look at the number who go to Australia and New Zealand, or the number who go to Brazil or Chile, it will be significantly decreased. And that's because the distance the place is, we tend to find our interactions decrease as you go further away. Not always, but generally speaking. Second point now, the relative changes in the speed and capacity of 2 types of transport responsible for the flow of goods, materials, and people. And we will talk about this in a later lesson, but the role of cargo ships and this process called containerization, and aeroplanes, the speed that they have allowed people to move about the world. And what that has created is what we call distance decay, a reduction in the amount of movement or spatial interaction between 2 places, the greater the distance they are apart, which kind of is very much linked to friction of distance. But the idea, again, there is actually a lot of distance decay has been eroded away when cargo ships can bring millions of consumer goods very quickly in these large cargo ships. But we'll talk more later on when we talk about containerization. So transport and ICT has created a shrinking world. That's why it's such an important concept. If you want to really wow the examiner, you could even put in the fact, the term time-space compression was first put forward by the geographer David Harvey back in 1989, and he refers to the phenomenon that alters the qualities of and relationship between space and time. I have pasted some detail on that particular process. Again, feel free to pause the video and extract some more notes if you want to develop your notes on time-space convergence. But again, it's a key concept which it's really important in your 12-mark questions, and we'll talk about how to structure those next lesson. But it's really important that you, when you are thinking about how to structure an essay, you're thinking, what were the key concepts that Mr. Cunningham discussed, or Mr. O'Driscoll discussed, that underpin some of these ideas? And it's important that you try to include them where possible. Again, feel free to pause this. I'm not going to go over it in too much detail, but what's happened, the impact of a time-space convergence has created a number of various improvements. And again, this is going into a lot more detail than we need at this particular point. But in your notes, you need to understand, as I said, the main factors accelerating globalization, and then have a bit of detail on the concepts that are causing it. Make sure you understand in your notes the concept of shrinking world and time-space convergence. That should help you there. How has it changed though? Because, and I put this slide up during one of our lessons, the second lesson, which is, it's very, very, very old, but it tells us just how far we used to, in terms of time, how long it used to take from London to go to various different places. Now, we're talking the red would be 5 days, the pink 5 to 10 days, and so on. It's crazy now when you think that you can take a flight and go from London to almost anywhere on this map you can see within 24 hours. Whereas here, Australia was taking 10 to 20 days. In certain parts of Australia, if you then had to get other transport methods, it could take you up to 40 days. That's all changed with the jet passenger aircraft. We went through a number of stages where speed started to improve, where we went from horse-drawn coaches to steam locomotives, 65 miles an hour, and steamships 38, 1950s propeller aircraft, 3 to 400, 1960s onwards, 600 to 700. So speed and time progressed over a very rapid period of time, and now everywhere can be accessed extremely quickly. But I raised this point, we're not all global hubs. Not everywhere is a connected place. So for instance, you might be able to get on this map, you can see East Africa, you might be able to get to, let's say, Kenya, Nairobi. But if you want to go further in to Kenya, you notice the dark colors start to increase. So you might be able to fly quickly, but to get to maybe a village outside of the capital, the transport methods slow down. It may be inaccessible to get to places. So we have definitely linked up key hub areas, but within countries, there are still areas that take time to get to. It's quite an important point. There's also islands that are cut off from these global hubs. And we'll say what I mean by hubs later, but it's areas where large concentrations of communications and travel happen. And there's a number of them in the world, quite clearly shown by this map. West, east coast of America, London, Paris. and so on. Tokyo, Beijing. Now, I'm going to pause here, but I'm going to give you a little sense of what we're doing this week and next week in our lessons. We're going to look at the roots of globalization. When did globalization start? What factors have accelerated globalization since the beginning of the 19th century? I'm going to focus a little bit more on how that's changed over time. So we're going to address the British Empire and from colonialism to capitalism. And I'm going to finish with this point before you enjoy going to your lessons next week, but it'll give you a little flavour of what's to come. Globalization's always taken place. It began in 1492, possibly even before that, but Columbus discovered the Americas then. Was that the start of globalization? From me, Miss Cunningham, I hope you've enjoyed this session, and it's 40 minutes worthwhile viewing that has hopefully made sure that your notes will be consolidated from your first 1.5 weeks, 2 weeks of lessons. From me, Miss Cunningham, take care, and I'll see you next week in lessons. Bye-bye. Ciao.